their experiences as business owners and as folks in the community to learn their perspectives and their experiences so that I can take those and work with them to address their needs, whether that ranges from trash isn't being picked up and I need to know what jurisdiction I could reach out to about this, all the way to I have an idea for a bill and this is something that would really benefit my business. And so part of the work that we do on the policy world is GSBA has a policy team, a lobbyist team in Olympia, and they are fantastic, and they are joining me here today to give an overview of our legislative session this year and the points of advocacy that GSBA held. Before that, I also want to introduce Shane, who is our, Shane, I'll let you introduce yourself, and then I'll let our lobbyist team introduce themselves.
Sure. So I'm Shane, he, him, and I'm the marketing and communications manager here at GSBA.
Thanks, Shane. And I'll invite our lobby team. Jean, do you want to start?
So I'm Jean Leonard, happy to be here today and to see some of you and hopefully talk a little bit about the crazy session that we just got through. I'm a lawyer by background. I've been lobbying for, I hate to admit it, but it's true, 30 years. Katie will say 300 years when she introduces me, but it's really only 30. So primarily with a business focus, a lot of business and tech clients that I've worked with for a long time, in addition to, of course, my personal favorite, the Washington wine industry, but a lot of business clients, a lot of tech clients. And I think that that my role with GSBA lobby team is to help keep a focus on the business issues, working through with other business lobbyists in Washington to make sure that we're aware and involved in all of those issues that are facing you and your member businesses. So hopefully we can keep you apprised of all that. Annie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie McGrath, she, her, and I am the newest member of your lobbying team in the Leonard Kolan firm in Olympia. My background, I started out working with the legislature in different positions. I was a legislative aide and then went to work with Jean and learned how to lobby, which was a pretty exciting transformation from moving within the legislature to working outside externally with the legislature. And then I left and served as the executive director for the Washington Brewers Guild for 8 years, where I ran the state trade association for all of the independent craft breweries in the state. And then just most recently spent a few years as the president and CEO at the Seattle Southside Chamber of Commerce. So really excited to be in this role with you all in Olympia. The small business has really always been at the heart of my interests in working with the legislature and policy, and getting to represent your chamber, coming from chamber world for the last few years, and getting to work with Gabriel in that previous role too. It's been just an honor and a privilege to get to do this work with you all in Olympia. And then I'll hand it over to Katie.
Thanks, Annie and Jean, and thanks, Gabriel. Katie Kolan, she, her. It says Leonard and Kolan, but you can refer to me as anything. You could snap, you can whistle. I consent to all of it. I will say that I am so pleased to be here on a personal level. I've had the privilege of being a GSBA scholar, and that's in my high school and college career prior to actually working with the state legislature. And then following that, I am also a lawyer by training and have the privilege of representing GSBA after I left the Washington State Medical Association. So again, that's a membership association, similar dynamics in terms of an association really seeking to serve its members. So GSBA filling that sort of niche for me at representing associations. It's really exciting work. It's exciting work as well for GSBA to be represented by the Leonard, Kolan, and McGrath team, because we really care about the work that we do down here. We care about business, we care about small business, we care about a chamber of this size being represented before the state of Washington. It is important, it is vital, especially now, for an organization like this to be represented before Olympia, so that when they make decisions, they think about us before they proceed. So Gabriel, with that, I know that we're happy to do session overview, kind of set the scene for where we're at, but I'll take that after you.
Awesome, great. Well, you kind of answered this question, but if you just want to dive a little bit more, why does GSBA have a lobby team, and why is it important for a chamber like ours to have one?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a really good one. The old adage down here is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And in that case, the decisions being made by the Washington State Legislature, as Jean said, she's been lobbying, I think, Jean, you said 30 years. I'm going to say all of us combined, we have 650 years of experience knowing that the legislature does exactly what it wants, whether or not you are paying attention. So in this case, with a very near Democrat supermajority, and I would suggest a legislature that is not as familiar or sensitive to, let's say, business interest or small business interest, it's really important that you have a lobbyist. What we do is we are down in Olympia 24/7 available to legislators while that legislature is functioning. So if any legislator, any member of the legislative branch or the executive branch has a question, has a concern, they pick up the phone, they call Annie, they call Jean, they call me. And large picture, big picture, we act as an insurance policy. So we actually had to explain this the other day to somebody with whom we work, that what we want to do, our goal is for a legislator to think of us and pick up the phone and call us before they have a silly idea. So we want to exist in their mind. We want them to think of GSBA prior to making their ideas come to the floor in the form of a bill. And everybody on this call and everybody who's listening will know that the legislature has a ton of ideas. Some are great, some are not so great, and we want them to be able to pick up the phone and call Jean or Annie or me as they move through their decision making. And that's regardless of party. We work across party lines. We've got strong relationships with Republicans, strong relationships with Democrats. And Gabe, it's not too long ago, it was 2013, 14, where Republicans were actually in control of the Senate chamber. Not too far away from seeing that again, I would suggest. We could probably predict that in another 3 to 5 years. So again, we do not take a political position, a party position on any folks in the legislature. It's we need to have a presence there representing GSBA as a business chamber, and knowing that GSBA is also an advocacy organization, our presence in the legislature is heavily weighted on the business side. Jean or Annie, anything you think I'm missing with that?
No, I would just add that, like, functionally, how this works and what it looks like in practice is, we're on the ground in Olympia during session. We're working with the legislature and legislators year round. But during session, what we're doing is we're monitoring legislation. Every day we're checking the introduction sheets. If we haven't heard an idea from a legislator yet, and we haven't already been involved in the development of legislation, we're monitoring to see what's being introduced that's going to impact GSBA members. We're working with Gabriel to identify and prioritize what these bills look like and how they're going to impact membership. And then Gabriel and their team at GSBA and then the Government Affairs Committee can really dive deep into the policy itself and get feedback and input to us so that we can make sure that we are part of shaping the policy as it moves through the legislature. So sometimes we get involved way before legislative session convenes, and we're working with legislators during the interim on issues and ideas and either trying to stop it from becoming legislation or to shape it before it's introduced. But other times we're just trying to catch things that we haven't seen before, that they're coming from, legislators that we may not have heard from over the interim or may not be aligned with us, usually, and it's something that we need to weigh in on. And so, having our presence in Olympia and making sure that we are keyed in and that the GSBA and their team are keyed in, and Gabriel does a great job of doing this as well. But having that presence in Olympia is really critical in terms of how we solicit feedback from members and how we move forward.
Yeah, I think that just the only thing Annie just said, having a presence, what's really important for you all is that we help maintain your visibility in the state capitol. We want legislators to know that you are watching, you're paying attention, you're engaged, you're involved, and they know how to reach you through us and through Gabe. So that's what it is. She said the word presence, and I'd say that's most of it.
Thank you so much, team. You're awesome. And I just want to remind all participants in the Zoom chat, for any questions, we'll have a Q&A at the end. Please put them in the chat. And then folks that are watching on Facebook as well, put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring those and bring those up at the end. So let's get into the meat of some things then. What were some of the major themes and topics that came up in this legislative session?
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. I'll go ahead and take this one. And Gabe, if you're all right with it, I'll give a little bit of context surrounding the session as well, because it'll frame the sort of themes that we saw for this legislative session. And this is also my caveat. we are going to not cover any hot goss. We're not going to have any fun on this call because this call is being recorded. So we always want to make sure that everybody knows that Gabriel is available all the time for additional and follow-up questions. As much as I'm mostly joking, you can follow along by typing in any bill numbers you hear into the leg.wa.gov site, so you can follow along on the policies. And also questions, Gabe, that we're not able to answer, we can of course follow up, or if there are any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking, we're happy to entertain those outside as well. So a little bit of context. The legislature, most of you showing up to this call will probably have a sense as to how the legislature works, but just a little bit of ground setting. The legislature runs in a biennial session, so 2 years of a session equals the legislative cycle. The first is 105 days, so the first year is 105 days. It's a long session. The job of the legislature is to pass an operating budget. The second session that we're going to go into in 2026 is a 60-day legislative session. And the job of the legislature is nearly exclusively to pass a supplemental budget. And in this case, the legislative session spanned 105 days from January 13th through April 27th. And it is all days. So that is holidays, that is evenings, that is mornings, that is any time of day that a legislator is around. We are present and functioning on your behalf. I'd suggest that this session was marked by significant fiscal challenges and a lot of business policy that impacted our work and your businesses. So a little bit of the political landscape. Democrats maintained their control. We had a big election year going into 2025 just prior to that. Democrats maintained control of both of the chambers as well as the governor's office. So a 30-19 majority in the Senate, 59-39 in the House. Governor Ferguson was inaugurated on January 15th. That's an important date for you to note. Governor Ferguson being inaugurated January 15th was already after the legislature had started its work. The governor's office is watching what's happening in the legislative session. He is, to our observation, as much as we've seen him come from the AG's office, he's untested. We don't know how he's going to function as governor. And at the beginning of the legislative session, he had some, you can go ahead and Google it yourself. He had some remarks publicly that sort of framed his perspective on where he would sit with taxes, with revenue, etc. And those remarks around taxes and revenue were important because this legislature was under significant fiscal challenges. So there are 19 webinars we could do to discuss the fiscal challenges and why the state of Washington was in the situation it was in. But Annie and Jean, tell me if you think I'm not capturing this correctly. But the legislature was facing, the state of Washington was facing between a 12 and sometimes we even heard 16 or $18 billion budget shortfall over the next 4 years. So the legislature ultimately they passed a $78 billion 2-year operating budget and a whole ton of revenue bills. So that combination to satisfy the state requirement to have a balanced budget was highly, highly pressurized by a $12 to $18 billion budget deficit. You also had legislators, Annie, you regularly say legislators in their campaign season made a lot of promises to their constituents and are going into a new legislature. So a lot of new members, new governor, highly pressurized budget situation, very financially stressed and a stressful time without even ignoring what's happening at the federal side of things. The state legislature was under an incredible amount of pressure. And I'd suggest we saw that play out with legislators getting sick, lobbyists getting sick, physically just having a lot of trouble, as well as it's emotionally tiring to do 105 days back to back with that kind of pressure. Jean and Annie, before I dive into sort of the really high level on some of the revenue proposals or kind of themes, big policy bill themes, anything you want to add on those points?
I just think that the enormity of the budget shortfall can be misunderstood. It was a huge thing. I just think I heard the other day, our budget deficit, let's say 12 billion. California had the same deficit, I heard on the news, and they have 10 times the budget, 10 times the size of the budget that we do. So a significant challenge for these legislators, and as frustrated as we might get with some of the maneuverings around budget and taxes, I just think that's something that we need to acknowledge at the outset, is it was a substantial challenge from day one, or before day one,
And
actually.
so, Jean, how does that change our behavior? What does that mean as lobbyists? Do we go in and ask for everything we want? Are we trying to stop the bleeding? Like, what are we trying to do as lobbyists?
Well, as Gabe will tell you, you can ask for whatever you want, and we'll tell you lots of times, no, that's not going to happen, because we have a reality to face. There's lots of great ideas that we have, as well as great ideas that legislators have. And sometimes our job as your on the ground team is to make sure that we do our best to level your expectations, to make sure that your expectations are reasonable as to what you can and maybe even should ask for in such a challenging legislative session. So sometimes it would narrow the focus of those things that we ask for and turn us into a defensive mode lobby team, which of course we're always doing that as well. But I'd suggest with that kind of an outlay at the beginning, that's how we set it up. We'd be prepared to defend you instead of maybe moving some really wonderful ideas forward. We just have to tell you, probably not going to happen. Let's hold off until there's a little bit more reasonable environment to work in.
And so to that end, and happy to take some questions on the specifics of this. I'm just going to spit out a few items here. Business and occupation surcharge. So that was House Bill 2081, and that bill passed, raising a lot of revenue on the business and occupation surcharge side. You all know that we do not have an income tax, so the levers that the legislature can play with are fewer. There was Annie, maybe you can give in a minute a little background on the payroll tax, because that was considered for a while, modeled after Seattle. Financial institutions tax, property tax cap adjustment, Senate Bill 5814. That was essentially a large sales tax. I say excise tax / sales tax because some of us still don't know, and the courts will have to answer questions about the construction of that bill. How does it act? Does it act like a sales tax? Who does it target inappropriately? So still open legal questions on some of these big revenue proposals that needed to get the legislature to satisfy its requirement in law to have a balanced budget. So the revenue measures that passed are projected to bring in about $9.5 billion to address the deficit. And of course, those monies go to fund things like education, public policy, public safety, infrastructure, yada, yada. And so those revenue components, as much as they are sold as being a benefit to all to pay for all of the programs and services that we enjoy in Washington state, I would also suggest that these taxes were very aggressive and did hit the business community very, very pointedly and very hard. So much so, and again, I'm not a legislator, go talk to your legislators. That's something that we strongly encourage you to do, and hopefully we'll have a minute to talk about. But it was loud and clear. I'm not saying anything that everybody doesn't already know. Business was very pointedly targeted in these revenue proposals.
And there are some new business areas that that will be taxed that haven't been taxed in the past, right? Including digital advertisers, some types of consultants. Do you kind of want to talk about that a little bit? Who are those smaller businesses that'll be impacted by these?
Yeah, sure. And Jean and Annie, pipe up as I'm thinking about this. Like, for example, 5814, Gabriel, you mentioned advertising services, electronic advertising. We're still, the courts, I would suggest, are probably going to have to tackle that question. We also saw taxes on, for example, temporary staffing companies, and that can result in a up to 10% tax on the use of basically state temporary staffing in state. Digital products being taxed, digital data processing services taxed, cigarette taxes, other tobacco related products taxed. They changed. There are some other components that can be pretty nitty gritty: information technology, technical consulting services, custom website development services, investigation security service, security monitoring services, and armored car services. So, I mean, you have the state of Washington staff and legislators who are going through line by line in the industry code, figuring out where they're going to get enough revenue to satisfy balancing their budget. And again, this is Jean and Katie. We don't have a particular opinion on one way or another, other than we represent GSBA's interest. And Gabe was fantastic when we saw pieces of legislation that were going to attempt to undo programming that our members enjoy. jumping in on those proposals to try to stop the bleeding, so to speak. But again, there was no escaping the sort of buzzsaw that was this legislation. And Annie, Jean, am I forgetting anything? I'm sure I know we have wins.
Yeah, so I would just add in while we're on revenue, there were various proposals throughout the entire session. So ultimately the legislature landed on a $9 billion revenue package that included what Katie just walked through, the additional sales tax on types of services like digital advertising, staffing, and others, and then also an overall increase to B&O rates for many different sectors. But early in session, we saw a lot of different proposals, and this was stuff that GSBA really had to weigh through and look at how it was going to impact members. We saw a proposal that would have increased the payroll tax on businesses, something very similar to what Seattle's done with Jumpstart. We saw more progressive revenue proposals like a wealth tax floated early on, and that one again was met by a lot of resistance from the governor, who felt it wasn't legally sound and would be tested in the courts, and was looking for initiatives that were going to bring in money right away to deal with the budget issue, that was pressing at hand. And so, what we ended up with in the end was a package that came through very, very late in the process with very little time for industry to weigh in on. And I do want to commend Gabriel and the team at GSBA for being ready to jump on it when it came through, because there was not a lot of warning and there was not a lot of opportunity to push back on these proposals.
Annie, say a little bit more about late. So the type of what is Gabriel doing? So we often wonder what Gabriel is doing, but then he usually pulls out with a plan and a way to guide the policy council to success. So in this case, Gabriel was reviewing payroll tax proposals, et cetera, contemplating how this would hurt our membership. He still has to do all that work. And then ultimately, when did we actually see the proposals that were voted on?
Right. Well, for the package that, I guess, the package that they actually passed and the governor signed, many of those components we only saw 10 days before the legislature adjourned. So 10 days prior to the legislature being done, adjourning sine die, was the first time we had an opportunity to review that legislation. And so I think what was really critical there was that GSBA was able to, because they had early conversations with members and with the Government Affairs Committee and had spent time working on the earlier proposals, was in a good position to determine where membership was going to be on these and how they were going to be impacted, and to be able to show up to the hearings, to be able to contact legislators, to be able to get out grassroots messaging to membership so that they can contact their legislators, and to be on the record in the hearings and on the record in terms of letters to legislators and also the governor's office. And it moved really, really quickly. And so that prep work and being ready and understanding their membership was critical to actually getting to be a part of the conversation moving forward. Yes, the package still moved forward. We knew ultimately something was going to pass, but your voice was there, your voice was heard. And as the legislature may revisit some of these proposals in the future, you are already in a position to be a part of that conversation moving forward, and a critical part of that conversation.
And we'd suggest that although the governor did sign the tax package that was presented to him, there was one minor veto in the whole thing. There was a significant veto request effort undertaken by the entire business community and a lot of individual companies and areas of interest and chambers and everybody weighing in. The governor did note as he signed the bills that there was work to be done. He pretty much hinted that we may well expect some changes in the supplemental budget next year. What we've suggested is that it was so fast, particularly with 5814, that there are so many unknowns, unintended consequences that are possible. So I'm going to suggest that it's a good thing that the governor has stated out loud that these provisions will be reviewed over the interim. He mentioned legislative leadership, governor's office, and the business community in those conversations. So again, stay tuned, stay involved.
And Gabriel, if you'll indulge, I know that I'd suggest it would be helpful for this group to I'll give a quick 15-second overview of big theme legislative policy work that the legislature undertook. And then I know that this group probably wants to hear around wine related issues. They probably want to hear about, I know that there were bills addressing social media and outreach, and that would have impacted LGBTQ IA folks in that work. So just a little bit of context setting. As much as we're interested in what small business and what business generally is doing before the state legislature, and we are dogged about requiring legislators to know that we are their constituents, the legislature also had other things that GSBA does monitor and track and educate on, but not necessarily weighing in on. So for example, transportation funding, we're all going to see a 6% 6 cent per gallon tax increase effective July 1 of this year. Unemployment benefits for striking workers, incredibly controversial. Legislation that's granting up to 6 weeks of unemployment benefits to workers on strike. And so this aligns us with a couple of other states specifically for that policy. Rent control, House Bill 1217, capping annual rent increases at 7% plus inflation, or 10%, whichever is lower. So really complicated, very controversial issues that all of these revenue discussions and business discussions are happening at the same time as these controversial issues. Jean, are you Jean, Queen of the Washington Wine Institute? Will you talk a little bit about, I think the Wine Institute's actually a crisp example of how the legislature was trying to, how will I say it delicately, not be nice to wine.
It wasn't personal. So there were several alcohol proposals, and anybody who's known me for any time at all, I always talk about wine because wine is special. We're different and we're generally treated that way for the last 3 years running. And we want to thank GSBA and Gabe for weighing in on the 0.05 bill. The proposal would have lowered the blood alcohol level from 0.08 to 0.05. Not only is that an impossible standard to measure to, it also would make no difference at all in behavior, except for as to socially responsible people who pay attention to what the laws are anyway. So the industry, the hospitality industry, and overall was concerned that it would dissuade the socially responsible persons from even coming into a winery or a restaurant to have a glass of wine out of fear of hitting a 0.05 level. The law, if you are intoxicated, if you are apparently intoxicated, if you appear to be intoxicated, the law already allows you to be taken in no matter what your blood alcohol level limit is. This would have imposed what's called a per se violation. So no matter what, you would be presumed and you would be criminally liable if you happen to be cited for 0.05 and tested to that level. It's been a hard fight because it's really hard to go in there and say, no, we like drunk drivers, because of course nobody likes drunk drivers. That's our whole focus, is to make sure that people drink responsibly. And I'd suggest we were able to persuade, once again, enough legislators that this particular proposal would not help the big problem, which is people drinking far in excess of 0.05 or 0.08 or 1 or 3 times the legal limit. Those are the general drivers who cause the problems on our roadways. It's a hard issue to deal with because I've lost a friend to a drunk driver, many of us have. So we're very delicate in our presentation and careful to deal with the statistics and the fact that there's one state that has passed a 0.05 law, and that's Utah, not known for its booming wine industry. And it didn't work. There was a blip at first where they thought it looked like it was working. It did not work. Their drunk drivers fatalities have actually increased since they adopted the 0.05 bill. So thank you again. It really helps to have broad-based voices in support of such a delicate issue. And we know GSBA, you guys were there at the very beginning. There was a wine tax that was proposed. We were working on that one. There was a wine study, which was going to, or an alcohol tax. There was an alcohol study that would have likely resulted in raising wine and beer taxes in order to lower liquid spirits taxes, which we had to get in the middle of. And at the end, we ended up with one bill that passed that has to do with an increase in permits, license fees. And I'd suggest, Annie, we weren't as hard hit as we clearly could have been. So that's the one where we just kind of kept our heads a little bit low, made sure that things didn't get worse. And again, it was really helpful to have the GSBA behind your Washington wine industry and your Washington brewers industry, because they're great small businesses in our community who are doing the right thing. So we appreciate your support on that level. avoided other big hit stuff. So thank you again. Annie, I don't think I forgot any of the
No, I
underlying
just,
stuff.
those were, I mean, those were all bills that really would have impacted the hospitality industries here in Washington that we all know continue to struggle and pull themselves out of the pandemic. And so, you know, it's the culminating factor of these small, maybe smaller pieces of legislation, but you know, as they pass and as they continue to impact these industries that we represent here with GSBA, it becomes harder and harder for these businesses to recover and thrive. You know, so those issues. Any one of them on their own would have been a hit for the industries, and it would have been a hard hit for the industries. And then if you think about if they had all passed together, what our hospitality businesses would be looking at right now. So I think that was a real success story this session on behalf of members. And then I'd add another one that we worked on, and I don't know how many times Gabriel had to travel down to Olympia to testify on this bill, but we had a win for tourism, which we know tourism is incredibly important for a lot of our industry members and our membership that depend on tourism for the viability of their businesses all across the state in every region of Washington. Brought forward legislation this year that GSBA and other trade associations that are hospitality based across the state supported, that would create a advisory committee that's going to meet over the interim to provide a report back to the legislature in November that would establish a framework for a new self-assessment model for funding tourism. We know here in Washington, we are woefully underfunded in terms of our tourism promotion and destination development efforts compared to other competitive states here in the West and really all across the US. We are currently funded out of the general fund, which makes us susceptible to the dips when we have issues like we did this session. We were happy, I would say we were grateful to be able to protect the $3 million for tourism promotion and destination development programming in Washington that's required by statute here. You know, unfortunately, we weren't able to maintain the increases that the legislature has made over the last few years. You know, in the last biennium, tourism was funded at an increase of $9 million for the biennium, and we are back down to that baseline kind of bare bones funding of $3 million, but feeling very fortunate that the legislature didn't cut it further because they did make some pretty drastic and brutal cuts this year. So holding on to that $3 million, but really excited about legislation that passed 5492 that's going to create this advisory group. We're going to have businesses and stakeholders at the table over the session, driving this effort that's going to be able to create a really meaningful tourism promotion program here in Washington, where the businesses that are part of the industry get to drive that effort and land on a funding mechanism that's going to provide long-term sustainable funding for tourism and that's not susceptible to cuts and swings with the general fund budget. So stay tuned on more of that effort. There's going to be a lot of work over the interim, and I'm sure we'll be providing a lot of regular updates on how that's going. Really excited to see what that legislation is going to look like next year.
Yes, and thank you so much for your work on that. And I think the tourism effort really highlights kind of the ethos that GSBA held while we were discussing how we show up in this budget process. We understand that our small businesses benefit from some areas of government support. We support our Small Business Academy and several folks in getting their business up and running through development assistance with Department of Commerce. We have supported folks with the Small Business Resiliency Loans programming, which provides loans to businesses that need an additional help in this time of economic straits, as well as community development programming that helps support diverse small businesses in areas where they have historically had difficulty in getting started up. So through that, we really advocated for our state to continue funding areas and programs that provide a strong return on investment. And that includes areas like tourism. Every dollar we put into tourism funding provides, I think, almost a $3 return on investment. And we see the same results with funding for small business support and grants and loans, et cetera, for businesses and business environments in cities. And so when we advocated, as the government was facing several cuts to make and several hard decisions to make, we really wanted to highlight those particular programs that do benefit businesses, especially small businesses, and seeing those continue. And we were successful in retaining some budgets in the Department of Commerce that has been allocated to small business support as well, which we were happy to work with our partners in the community with. And so kind of going from there, what was your, I know we've kind of touched on this a lot already, but what was your experience in working in like listening in on these budget discussions and listening in on all the different asks these organizations were making? I imagine that was a very difficult conversation to be a part of.
Yeah, gosh, Gabe, that's a huge question. And it's a wild, the legislature is always just wild. Like, it's just a wild place to be. They do what they want when they want. And one of the best things about this job is the legislature does what it wants to do, and it's never, ever boring. So not only as a matter of policy is it intellectually, fun, but when you're actually watching either policy bills or budget bills or revenue bills move ahead or die, it's so consequential. So what we noticed is there are some industries that you might not even know existed that kind of come out of the woodwork when you see revenue proposals like this that are so far reaching. So as somebody who's done this legislative work for, enough time, 15 years pushing a legislature to the brink here with a $12 to $16 billion deficit is scary. There were times where we didn't necessarily think that the legislature would come to an agreement on a balanced budget. So we were looking at a special session. There was, I think, Annie, Jean, probably we were doing some over-unders on special sessions, but there was a time when we were convinced that we were going to have a special session, probably halfway through. For about 3 weeks there, we were convinced we were going to head to a special session. That is not a great place to be. Legislators don't want to be there. We don't want to be there. GSBA doesn't want to be there. It's high risk, low reward. So when we saw the business community really step up in discussions with Democrats, when the business community really stepped up in a respectful way to the legislature, it's helpful to reflect on this at this point. I was very proud of the business community and how they handled themselves before the legislature. We are integral to the health and function of the state of Washington. So the legislature, I will suggest, has some very tough questions to answer of its constituencies, and we'll have some tough conversations with legislators when it comes to election season. So those are going to be, we're always thinking about that during session. You don't do fundraising during the legislative session. Those two things it's illegal to do that. So we don't talk about those things. At the same time, we're also looking at what are these conversations going to look like for the next 2 years? Our business is going to exist in Washington the way that they exist now. Those are questions that businesses are really showing up to represent their interests. We work a lot with the Association of Washington Business. That's the broader statewide business chamber. They will drive many of the discussions that are really public and front facing, but a lot of the discussions that we're in, as well as AWB, is these are really behind the scenes conversations. And so I'd suggest that where GSBA was instrumental is also working with our partner associations, working with AWB, making sure that we are in alignment with them, and making sure that more importantly, that they're in alignment with us. Annie and Jean, did you have a sense of, I know that other chambers were really involved in work, but don't have quite as unique a voice as GSBA's does. Anything stand out for you guys this session on how business showed up on revenue and budget questions?
I think you had to be a lot more intentional this year about prioritizing what the needs were, because I think everybody had an understanding that there were going to be losers this session and very few winners. Just the gravity of the budget situation was such that even with a $9 billion tax package, what we're hearing was the biggest tax increases in Washington ever, they still made completely, brutal cuts to basic services and programs. And not to mention economic development funding was slashed as well through the Department of Commerce. And so I think that business interests had to be really intentional about how they prioritized and represented on different topics, with that understanding, knowing that not only were we going to see some new revenue, but we were also going to see some cuts to things that we really care about and depend on. And so finding that balance, you didn't hear, I mean, you definitely heard no, you heard a lot of defensive work, you heard a lot of opposition. Business came out strong to defend itself this session. But I think that as Katie said, the business community was very thoughtful and very intentional with the work with the legislature and how it laid out its priorities and, what was truly important this session.
Because it really did come down to, can these businesses stay open?
Mm-hmm.
And that will be the theme next year as well. So part of our job as your lobby team is to coach you to appreciate the right questions to come into the legislature. So if you approach the legislature with too many thoughts at one time. Part of our job is to suggest to you when you're going to be most effective, not just how you're going to be effective, but when. So if GSBA has an opportunity, for example, to jump in on a student bill of rights bill, now is the time to do it, because that's when the legislature is tackling it and we better be ready to go. Similarly speaking, when now is the opportunity to run a tourism promotion and sustainability program, then now is the time to do it. It might not be 5 years from now. It might not have been 4 years ago. Now is the time to do that. So Jean, I don't know, does anything pop up for you? And then Gabriel, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the sort of advocacy related components of GSBA's work on student bill or parental bill of rights, etc. But Jean, anything popping up for you?
Well, I think it's just important to recall that, and Gabriel's going to talk about this a little bit more, your own involvement in meetings with legislators during the interim, that's an important part of this whole system. If you are a business that has been directly impacted by some of the tax increases, keep track of that. Take notes, have a personal story about what you had to do. Maybe you couldn't hire a temporary staff person because there was going to be a 10% sales tax on the wages of hiring people who you need to hire. It's keep track of those little issues. Keep individual examples of when one of these budget impacts impacted you directly. Keep track of it. Keep notes. The legislature, I'm going to suggest, is more interested in hearing from you sometimes than from others with respect to the businesses and the small businesses that you represent. You're not a monolithic group that they hear from, like, oh, everybody's saying the same thing. If you all have a different story to tell, a slightly different angle on the impact of a tax on your employees or your company or your business or your inability to expand when you might have wanted to, just keep track of that. If you have any questions along the line, check in with Gabe, check in with us, and we'll, should you ask Gabe, should I ask this question? We'll let you know. Some things you don't want to say, some things you might want not to raise, but we're happy to help coach in those in issue areas, specific issue areas. But just pay attention to how anything the legislature did, whether budget, tax, or policy, that impacted you or your folks directly, your employees, your families. Pay attention to it, keep note, and then hopefully we'll be able to get some meetings with legislators over the interim to have a good conversation about those things.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, team. So just really quickly, I want to go over a little bit of GSBA's involvement in the Student Bill of Rights that was passed this year. So last year, there were 6 initiatives to the legislature that were presented. And one of them was 2081, which would have, it was dubbed as a parental bill of rights, but what it would have done is eliminate many of the protections to student confidentiality that have existed in our state since 1985. Allowing students, teachers, and nurses and health practitioners at schools to disclose confidential communications and conversations they have with students. And that would have really impacted not only LGBTQ students that work with their, that talk to their teachers about identity related issues, but also folks that encounter substance use or abuse in households. If they confide in a school counselor that information would then have been able to be relayed back to those parents and potentially putting those kids in worse situations. And so what we did was the legislator, so the community ended up working with the legislator over the summer and throughout the session to advise on a new bill, 1296, which would have basically taken away a lot of the negative provisions out of 2081 and replaced them with a bill that provides even more protections for our state's LGBTQ youth. And so what this new bill does, and this was successful and it was passed on the last day of bill signatures strategically by the governor. And so what this does is it reinforces the student's ability to speak confidentiality with educational professionals and medical professionals. It also allows students, it adds neurodivergence and houselessness and economic status to a protected status for kids to be protected against bullying or repercussions around their status included in that category. So more protections there. It expands protections for teachers who teach pro-LGBTQ sex ed or curriculum, as well as LGBTQ teachers themselves from potential lawsuits or folks that or attacks against them based on their identity. And it also expands protections for LGBTQ students by requiring school districts to create policies regarding gender expansive youth and how those folks are going to get support. And then it adds a ability for the OSP, Office of Superintendent of Public Education, to respond to schools and school districts that do not implement those protections by basically creating a way for folks to report those lapses, and then it creates and outlines a way for OSPI to work with those school districts to rectify those issues. And so it's a really fantastic bill that meets a lot of the holes that existed in our current legislation, as well as kind of fixes the gaps left by 2081 as well. So kind of going forward, I have one last question for you all, and then I also have some kind of additional questions, but I really want to open it up to Q&A as well. So folks, again, if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and we'll be able to answer those live with our lobby team. But for now, let's kind of kick it back to what you all just discussed a little bit of how can businesses engage with their legislators? How can they engage with you? And I know you kind of talked about why it's important, but any other ideas behind that as well?
Yes, you must get to know your legislators. These are part of what Jean and Annie and I don't get to share with groups very often, is the reason GSBA is effective, the reason we do our job. Jean, you said this the other day, they like us. Turns out people like to meet and talk about themselves and their interests, and we take a ton of our professional time meeting with legislators, casually meeting with them, professionally meeting with them, talking to them about what they're interested in, getting to know them. And Jean, this is work that we have done over generations, years and years of building these relationships. When a legislator knows who you are, and they know the business you have, and they know that you vote for them in district, or they understand and appreciate why perhaps you don't, that's when we start to see effective lobbying. Jean and Annie are fantastic. Gabe, you're amazing. But really what happens, and what we need to see, what we need to have, is a legislator thinking of you and your business when they're making their decisions.
I think the only cautionary tale, as I mentioned, if you're going to meet with a legislator, we like to make ourselves available to just give background on, there's publicly available profiles on legislators, so you can kind of get a better idea who they are, where they come from. The one thing I'd say, and it sounds kind of funny, and it's what I mentioned briefly, is there are some things that you don't want to say. And I'm going to suggest it's as simple as be kind. They have a very difficult job. We may totally disagree with something that they did. You may feel attacked for some reason on some issue, on some specific issue, on a tax, on something, whatever it is, something personal. we find that the best way to have a conversation with a legislator is to remember that above all else, they are human beings just like we are. We get to agree to disagree, but hopefully respectfully. And I know this sounds silly to a group like this who's highly informed and highly educated and aware of community and issues, but it really is what we're talking about when we say there's certain things you don't want to talk about. It just means things that just be polite, be kind, listen, agree nicely. It's what you would say to everybody that you work with if you're going to have a situation where you might agree to disagree. So I'd say it sounds pretty silly and pretty trite, but please first be kind. And then I think you find an open door where you can then have a more detailed conversation about a specific issue.
That's real. Thank you. We do have a question in the audience. Why do you think the Washington legislature has a high potential to turn Republican in the coming years?
Oh, good question. Why do I'm sometimes just guessing, I would suggest there could be enough shifts in positions where members are coming over from the House to the Senate side, and the Senate dynamic generally being a more, and I don't even necessarily mean this politically, being a little bit more of a conservative body. It could line up with certain pieces falling where they fall, that it would be a Republican-controlled legislature. The margins have gotten wider in recent years, but sometimes the margins are 1, maybe 2 seats. And so if we get to a position where there's that thin a margin in the races with hundreds of seats in Washington state, if it comes down to a difference of 1 and 2 seats, we could see that change. The chances are probably pretty low, but it's happened before in recent history. And I would actually suggest that a Republican-controlled legislature try to get to the 20,000 or 30,000 foot level. A lot of what we see in Washington state, a lot of the bread and butter work that we do is nonpartisan and arguably bipartisan. So when we work with Republicans all the time who are our friends, we work with Democrats all the time who are our friends, and it would be foolish when you guys are meeting with your legislators to make assumptions about their politics without having those questions and those questions and conversations. Like Jean said, you don't need to agree with everything everybody says, but it is a great opportunity for them to get to know you. We need you. You're not dating these folks. We need you to get to know them, and they need to get to know you. It's a way for not only selfishly our advocacy to have a broader reach, but our membership needs to be known in the districts that we're in, including Republican-controlled districts. And often, I think you might be surprised that some of our Republican legislator friends are actually fantastic for our business issues.
It's real. So I have another question from one of our registrants, and I also want to answer this one, but I'll let y'all go first. What about the current national landscape scares you for queer people here in Washington state?
Dang. Brutal. Gabe, you're probably the best one to answer that question. But I know that Annie and Jean and we care deeply about our community and want to make sure that we are represented well when a government is making changes. I'm going to abstain from that comment, but I think, Gabe, you're probably in a good position to tackle it.
Yeah, so in the beginning of his term, I think actually on the first day, or if not the first week of his governorship, Governor Ferguson announced an executive order that requires Department of Health to survey everything that's going on and everything they can do to support gender affirming and reproductive health care in Washington state in light of the changes at the federal level. And so through that, I was invited to speak at a March 15th panel. It was kind of an all day, like an 8-hour thing where the DOH was just listening to community and compartmentalizing all the different issues and areas that they can improve. And they're now making a list, checking it twice, and creating a bunch of recommendations to provide to the governor. And so that's just to say that Washington state, is one of the best places to be in this country right now, if not the best, I would argue, because of the effort and the care that our government is bringing to support our community. They really understand the issues that are impacting us. And I've met so many individuals within the governor's office and within the Department of Health and other agencies that have just been really good allies, like, literally telling me, you know, anything I can do. If you hear of anything in the community, like email me and I'll do everything I can to support that. And so I feel, you know, an example is the community let the Department of that they do the birth certificates know that there's a 10-month wait on birth certificates updates for gender markers. And they all went in on a weekend and busted through all of the backlog so that there is now no backlog for birth certificates. And they did that, you know, to support our community, just knowing the importance there. And so, you know, I really would say Washington, I feel very, very safe and protected. The biggest threat, though, is the potential for the federal government to rescind budgeting for and budgetary support for Medicaid and for education if, you know, our institutions continue to support gender affirming and reproductive care through those avenues. Our state is working on a plan of what to do if that happens. Hopefully it will not, but I would say that's probably the biggest kind of concern right now is the, you know, potential for federal support to stop being provided to us. All right, well, okay, fun one. Are there any bills you particularly enjoy working on? Any fun stories?
Nothing that's going to be eligible under this recorded webinar. No, Annie, Jean, does anything come to your mind? There were a lot of fun ones this year.
Well, it sounds kind of silly to say that it was fun, but it was actually fun to work on the social media bills because of the, you know, some of us are pained by being lawyers and we can't help but think that we should support the Constitution and free speech and such. So it was kind of fun to be able to dig in on those bills, despite the fact that it was not fun at all because they just kept coming. But interesting to say the least, and quite the adventure.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Those bills were and how they would have impacted LGBTQ businesses. I'm thinking about the algorithm one.
Oh gosh, yeah, was that 2083? Was that 2083? There
were so many.
There were so many.
Yeah, I think the big one though was the so-called addictive feeds bill that would have basically broken the algorithm that social media companies use. And it, you know, the genesis of the bill and the intent behind the bill was a good one. I'm a mom, my kids are on TikTok. I get it. I understand what the concerns are. But this was AG request legislation that would have restricted the use of so-called addictive feeds and algorithms for minors. But it did it in a very broad and prescriptive way that basically would have only allowed minors to subscribe to feeds that appeared before them in a chronological order and only of the followers that they choose to follow. So there would be no algorithm that was feeding these kids, you know, things of interest to them. I know that my kids can go down a rabbit hole. Maybe they only know a few people to follow. And so they're not being exposed to other things. I think that the bill neglected to contemplate the areas where it makes sense for kids to have exposure to other ideas and other support systems, things that they may not be getting at home, things that they may need in terms of community. And also the bill went further and it would make it so that even adult feeds would default to this too. And so obviously it was really problematic in many ways for GSB members, and that, you know, and if anyone who's using advertising, anyone who's using outreach, anyone who is putting events out there, you wouldn't be able to see events in your feed as minors. I mean, it was incredibly broad. And then, and really the first iteration of the bill would have impacted the internet in its entirety. It wasn't just social media companies that it applied to. There were a lot of privacy restrictions and protocols that basically anybody who operates a website or an application would have to adhere to. So it was a big, big bill, and ultimately did not make it all the way through the process. It did come out of the Senate and then died in the House. So we fully expect that bill to be back next year, and are looking forward to GSBA being a part of, you know, some thoughtful conversation around how are we actually protecting kids online, and not going overboard in terms of being prescriptive and regulating the internet.
And I think that's fun. Of, you know, the work that GSBA does and highlighting how things can impact communities in ways that initial drafters of the bill or legislators might not have considered. You know, they see a bill and they think this is great for one group, but then, we really bring in how does that impact the LGBTQ community or other marginalized communities that do connect via social media. So it's important to have those voices at the table because, otherwise they might not be, those ideas just might not have been thought of. But thank you so much, everyone, and lobby team so much for your work. You're fantastic to work with. Members that are tuning in, I just want you to know that you can reach out to myself and I can connect you with our lobby team at any time, and we're happy to talk things over. We are a service to you as our members. And I also want to thank so much to our sponsor, DoorDash, for allowing this to happen. They've also been an amazing partner with our legislative and policy work. And so thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next session.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.